In the name of God, hello everyone. The subject of this session is temporal and infratemporal fossa. The temporal fossa is a space in the lateral side um, of the skull, and the squamous part of the temporal bone, parietal bone, frontal bone, and lateral side of the sphenoid, greater wing of the sphenoid bone form the bony framework of this fossa. This fossa, bounded by the temporalis line above and zygomatic arc below. Uh, it is limited laterally by the temporal fascia. The temporal fascia uh, limited laterally this fossa. The posterior surface of the uh, frontal process of zygomatic bone and posterior surface of the zygomatic process of frontal bone um, form the anterior boundary of the temporal fossa. The floor of the temporal fossa is open. It is an important point that the floor of this fossa is open, and the boundary of this area, the boundary of this open floor, um, is the zygomatic arc laterally and infratemporal crest um, that are located on the greater wing of sphenoid bone medially. Um this structure defined this anterior, this inferior boundary of this fossa, or define the floor, the open floor of the temporal fossa. The content of the temporal fossa. The major content of temporal fossa is this muscle, the temporalis muscle. The temporalis muscle, that is a masticatory muscle, is the major structure in the temporal fossa that fill the that is full the temporal fossa. Other contents in this fossa are some of the artery, vein, and also nerves. The zygomaticotemporal branch of the maxillary nerve. This nerve. Zygomaticotemporal nerve or branch of maxillary nerve. This nerve is one of the contents in the temporal fossa. This nerve is a cutaneous nerve that supply the skin on the temporal fossa, and also supply the skin in the lateral and inferior part of the forehead. Um, the deep temporal nerve, this nerve, deep temporal nerves. Um, these nerves pass above lateral strigoid muscle to enter the deep surface of the temporalis muscle. These nerves, deep temporal nerves, uh, uh, passes deep, deeply to the temporalis muscles and come to the temporal fossa. The deep temporal arteries and veins. Deep temporal arteries, these arteries, and also vein. The deep and also superficial temporal arteries. deep and superficial temporal arteries and veins. Um, these uh, arteries and veins supply the temporalis muscle, and um, these arteries arise from the second part of the maxillary artery, um, and enter on its deep aspect and also superficial aspect. And as I said, these branches that come to the temporal fossa, superficial and deep to the temporalis muscle, um, supply the uh, temporalis muscle. And about the temporalis muscle, this muscle. Uh, the temporalis arise from the whole of the temporal fossa. Its fibers converge and descend uh, into a tendon, into the tendon that passes through the gap between the zygomatic arc and the side of the skull, passes from the roof of the temporal fossa, and the tendinous part of this muscle is attached to the medial surface, and also apex and anterior and posterior border of the coronoid process of mandible, and to the anterior border of the mandibular ramus. This muscle, um, such as other masticatory muscles, are innervated by the mandibular nerve. The mandibular nerve innervates the masticatory muscles and innervate the temporalis muscle. The contraction of this muscle elevate and retract the mandible, elevate and retract the mandible, and close the mouth. Infratemporal fossa. Other fossa in the face is infratemporal fossa. The infratemporal fossa, this area, the shape, infratemporal fossa, lies deep to the ramus of the mandible, inferior to the temporal fossa, and lateral to the lateral pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone and pharynx that are located in this area. Lateral to the pharynx and lateral pterygoid process of sphenoid, inferior to the temporal fossa, and medial to the mandible. The infratemporal fossa has a roof, anterior, lateral, and medial walls, and is open in the um, um, posterior inferiorly part. It has no anatomical floor. This fossa has no anatomical floor. Um, its roof, this part, its roof formed by the greater ring of the sphenoid bone and a small triangular portion of the squamous part of temporal bone, this pink part. This the greater wing of the sphenoid, and squamous part of the temporal. These parts form the floor of the um, the roof of the infratemporal fossa. The anterior wall, this part, the anterior wall is formed by the posterior surface of the maxilla and ending inferiorly to the maxillary tuberosity. Um, the inferior orbital fissure uh, form, forms the upper limit of anterior wall, and posteriorly um, we can see the styloid process of the temporal bone, and also carotid sheath and its content. The medial wall is formed anteriorly by the pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone, and posteromedially by the pharynx. Um, in the medial wall of the infratemporal fossa, we can see a fissure, this fissure, the trigomaxillary fissure. This fissure is trigomaxillary fissure, and this is located on the medial wall of the infratemporal fossa, and the lateral wall is formed by the medial surface of ramus of mandible. This part from the inferior view of the skull, this purple color, is infratemporal fossa, or this part and this part in the shape. This fossa is infratemporal fossa. The contents of infratemporal fossa. In this fossa, we can see two muscles. The pterygoid muscles, medial pterygoid and lateral pterygoid muscle. We can see ligaments, sphenomandibular ligaments. Can see the pterygoid venous plexus, maxillary artery. The first and second part of the maxillary artery are located in the infratemporal fossa. This artery has three parts, and just the first and second part are located in the infratemporal fossa. Mandibular nerve and these branches, chorda tympani nerve, and also in this fossa there is a ganglion, the otic ganglion. Um, the contents of the infratemporal fossa, one of the contents is the lateral pterygoid muscle. This muscle. The lateral pterygoid muscle is a masticatory muscle and is a short and thick muscle consisting of two heads. This muscle has two heads, the upper head and lower head. The upper head rises from the infratemporal surface and infratemporal crest of greater wing of the sphenoid bone, and the lower head origin from the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone, the lateral surface of lateral pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone. The upper head and lower head of the lateral pterygoid origin from these parts, and the fibers converge and pass backward and laterally um, to be inserted into the a depression on the front of the neck of mandible. muscle is a masticatory muscle and innervated by the uh, mandibular nerve. Contraction of this muscle pulls the condyle of mandible anteriorly into the articular eminence and open the mouth. This muscle, the lateral pterygoid muscle, open the mouth. Medial pterygoid. Medial pterygoid muscle is one of the components in the infratemporal fossa. This muscle is a thick and quadrilateral muscle with two heads or with two origins. The small superficial head, this part of the muscle, arises from the maxillary tuberosity and the pyramidal process um, of the palatine bone, and the deep head rise from the medial surface of lateral pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone. The fibers of medial pterygoid descend posterolaterally and are attached by a strong tendinous lamina to the medial surface of ramus of mandible near to the angle of the mandible. This muscle is also a masticatory muscle innervated by the mandibular nerve, and the contraction of the um, fibers of this muscle close mouth and also the contraction of the one side medial pterygoid in the left side or just in the right side can um, laterally displaces the mandible. Uh, other contents, other content of infratemporal fossa is the maxillary artery. The maxillary artery, this artery is a terminal branch of the um external carotid artery. The larger terminal branch of the external carotid artery, this branch is maxillary artery. Maxillary artery has three parts. The first and second part of the maxillary artery are located in the infratemporal fossa. Um, it passes between the neck of the mandible and um, sphenomandibular ligament. Um, this part is first part. The first part passes between the sphenomandibular ligament and neck of the mandible. Then the second part ascends obliquely forward and medial to temporalis and is usually superficial to the lateral pterygoid muscle. Um, and the second part leaves um, the fossa, the infratemporal fossa, um, through the pterygomaxillary fissure. The pterygomaxillary fissure that are located in the medial wall of the infratemporal fossa. When the maxillary artery pass from this fissure, this um, uh, part of the maxillary artery, the second part of the maxillary artery ended, and the third part is beginning. Uh, the first part of the maxillary, this part of the maxillary artery, um, as I said, um, this part um, is the part between the neck of the mandible and sphenomandibular ligament, um, and gives origin these branches. These branches origin from the first part of the maxillary artery. Um, the middle meningeal artery is the first branches that arise from the first part of the maxillary artery. It leaves the infratemporal fossa um, by the foramen spinosum to enter the cranial cavity. And other important branches that arise from the first part of the maxillary artery is the inferior alveolar artery, this branch. The inferior alveolar artery descends in the infratemporal fossa and finally enter to the mandibular foramen and supply the by the dental branch supply the tooth. Other branches of the first part are deep auricular, anterior tympanic, and accessory meningeal that supplies the auricle, the tympanic membrane, and also the middle middle cranial cavity, the meninge in the middle cranial cavity. And second part of the maxillary artery, this part. The second part of the maxillary artery is the part that related to the lateral pterygoid muscle and gives origin to deep temporal artery that ascend to the temporalis fossa and supply the temporalis muscle, and also masseteric, buccal, and pterygoid branches. That these branches supply the masseteric muscle, buccal muscle, buccinator muscle, and also pterygoid muscles. These branches are muscular branches that supplies the muscles such as masseteric muscle, buccal, and pterygoid muscle. And other content in the infratemporal fossa is a venous plexus, the pterygoid venous plexus, this venous plexus. Um, it is found partly between the temporalis and two pterygoid muscles. The spinopalatine, deep temporal, pterygoid, masseteric, buccal, alveolar, greater palatine, and also middle meningeal veins. These veins that are like the branches of the maxillary artery, these veins are tributaries of this plexus. This plexus finally drains into a short vein, the maxillary vein, this vein, and the pterygoid plexus communicate with inferior ophthalmic vein with this plexus communicate with the cavernous venous sinus in the cranial cavity, and also communicate with the facial vein, and the infection in the cavernous sinus of the in the orbit in the face can spread to the trigoid venous plexus, and the infection in the infratemporal fossa can spread also into the cranial cavity in the orbit and also in the face. The maxillary vein, this vein, um, run transversely and deep to the neck of the and are located deep to the neck of the mandible. This vein units with the superficial temporal vein and form the retromandibular vein. The retromandibular vein um, um, the retromandibular vein unit with this vein, the posterior auricular vein. The posterior auricular vein and retromandibular vein form the external jugular vein that descend in the neck. As I said, um, this venous plexus has connections with the sinus cavernous, with the orbit, and with the face, and this connection causes the spread of infection um, from the face or sinus cavernous. This connections causes the infection easily spread from the orbit, from the face and sinus cavernous to the infratemporal fossa, and it is an important relation between the venous plexus in this fossa and around veins. Other contents of the infratemporal fossa is mandibular nerve. The trigeminal nerve is the fifth cranial nerves. This nerve has three branches. Uh, One of the branches of the trigeminal nerve is mandibular nerve. The mandibular nerve is a mixed nerve. It has motor fibers and also has sensory fibers. The mandibular nerve um, enters to the infratemporal fossa by the foramen oval. This foramen, the shape is foramen oval. The mandibular nerve is largest trigeminal division, and it has sensory fibers and also motor fibers. The sensory branches supplies the teeth of the mandible, and the motor branches innervate the muscles of the mastication. Um, in the shape, you can see the division of the mandibular nerve. In the trunk, from the trunk, before division, before the anterior and posterior division of uh, mandibular nerve in the trunk, we can see the meningeal, medial trigoid, tensor tympani, and also tensor villi palatini branches that innervate the medial trigoid muscle, tensor villi palatini muscle, and tensor tympanic muscle, and also meningeal branch that innervate the meninge in the middle cranial fossa. And from the anterior branches, we can see these branches: the buccal, lateral pterygoid, masseteric, anterior deep temporalis, posterior deep temporalis, and from the posterior division, we can see the auriculotemporal nerve, lingual nerve, and inferior alveolar nerve. Uh, this nerve innervate this structure in the face, and this branch are located in the infratemporal fossa. Uh, and the sphenomandibular ligament. Uh, Other content of infratemporal fossa is this ligament, the sphenomandibular ligament, is a thin and fibrous bond that connecting the spine of the sphenoid bone in the base of the skull to the lingula of the mandible near the mandibular foramen. And otic ganglion. Otic ganglion, this small ganglion, are located in the infratemporal fossa. Otic ganglion is a small oval ganglion that's situated just below the foramen oval. This is foramen oval, and otic ganglion are located near to this foramen. It is a peripheral parasympathetic ganglion. The type of this ganglion is parasympathetic ganglion. Um, the periganglionic parasympathetic fiber um, fibers to the otic ganglion come from the glossopharyngeal nerve. The branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve is tympanic nerve. This tympanic nerve come to the tympanic cavity um, in come to the middle ear or tympanic cavity and form a plexus, a nervous plexus, the tympanic plexus. It branches from this tympanic plexus um, as a lesser petrosal nerve come to the otic ganglion, and um, these fibers, the lesser petrosal nerves, carries parasympathetic fibers for the parotid glands. This lesser petrosal nerve, that is a parasympathetic nerve and come from the glossopharyngeal nerve, come to the otic ganglion. These fibers synapse in the otic ganglion, and the post ganglionic fibers as the auriculotemporal nerve come to the parotid gland, and this nerve, the auriculotemporal nerve, innervate the parotid glands, the parasympathetic innervation of the parotid glands. Okay, it's enough for this session. Thank you so much.